There's an old adage, if your airspeed was greater than your altitude in the overhead, that's what you're looking for, right? Because the LSOs are out there, and man, if you could even be in a little afterburner at the time, that's even better. So if you could come down, I think, I probably would see 450, maybe 500 knots if I felt really good on that day. But you couldn't bleed the airspeed off if you flew parallel up the starboard side of the ship, and then did the overhead brake. You needed some turn to bleed energy. So what you would do is you'd come across the ass end, the stern of the ship, at your speed, but you'd start to pull right there. And then you could bleed off from 500 knots down to your approach speed to drop your gear flaps and all that other stuff and still be able to make the trap. But God forbid you screwed it up, right, and couldn't bleed the energy off, and you end up boltering, and which means missing the wires or get a wave off because you're not even in there. Now you've just caused a whole bunch of problems because the ship's got to wait again for you, and the whole time about Naval Aviation is trying to limit the time the ship's in the wind because they're vulnerable. Submarines, all that, you become a kind of it's not static, but a known speed and direction. And you don't want to have that for a long period of time. So a couple things also on cruises, as I mentioned, we were trying to get across the water, the Pacific, with very limited electronic emissions. So during the daytime, that's kind of an easy game to play flying because flight ops are going to continue. You knew where you were when you took off. You knew the PIM, the ship's planned intended movement. You knew on your cycle in an hour where the ship should be, and you could kind of find your way around using your onboard radar, paint the ship, and end up doing that. But you had to stay night current. And that in itself is now a whole big deal because usually when you land aboard the boat at night, you've got a holding pattern with guys stacked up behind the ship, and everyone lets down one at a time under radar control, and the controller's talking to you, he's giving you directions, and starting down on the glide slope, and you have instrumentation aboard the aircraft that's kind of like an ILS, right? Now, they wanted to kind of get rid of that as they're coming across. So it's like, okay, so since we can't put these guys in, it was called the Marshall stack, since we can't do that, how are we going to keep them night qualled? So the idea was they'd shoot you off the front end. You would time a certain amount going upwind. You would go crosswind, and you go downwind all on time, right, and turn your base and into final. And then the ship did have the ILS, for lack of a better term. It was needles at the time was the actual deal. They had it turned down. They could vary the amount of the output. So they had a limited ability to kind of keep it hidden as much as possible, but still give you some sort of ILS guidance at night to kind of get behind the boat in a position at 3/4 mile where you start doing it visually and talking to the LSO. So it's my turn to go do this thing. And I'm doing the pre-flight and walking out, and I notice there's like this cloud, there's a fog bank off the port side, right, on the left side of the ship. And, there's stars above us, but, there's clouds over to the left. And I know which way the relative wind's coming from because the ship's got to turn into the wind to do the light. And it's going to be a left turn, and it's going to go. And I'm talking to the RIA, and I go, you don't think they'd be dumb enough to, turn into this fog bank or weather and launch us, do you? He goes, well, I don't know. But so we get in, and I remember on the cat stroke, because now we turned into the wind, and it's crappy weather. And I remember on the cat stroke, I actually said, because you're up hot mic, I said, this is the dumbest fucking thing I think I've ever done in my life as we're going off. So we end up going off, and now the problem is it's not really a fog bank, it's a low overcast. And I think, and again, these may not be the exact numbers, but they maybe wanted us at 800 feet as we're flying this pattern around the ship, right? And they want you to keep the ship in sight. So now I got a decision to make with the reel. Are we going to go up through this because the scud layer is at 400 feet, let's say. Are we going to stay at this lower altitude, or are we going to poke through, try to do it all on time and hopefully end up behind the ship and come down on the ILS, and do it that way. And so we both agreed, let's keep the ship in sight. We'll be very careful, set the rad alt, the radial altimeter. So, we're worried about that 400 feet, and that's where, again, having two guys really helps out. And so we take our timing and seeing the boat off, floating around out there with its lights in this inky, milky black night. So take timing, come around and roll in on the final approach bearing. And I'm a little bit right of course, and of course I'm low because 800 feet is where I should have intercepted, but I'm going to have to drive in at 400 feet to intercept the glide path and come down. And I'm just working my tail off. I'm just concentrating, work probably as hard as I ever did on a night landing. And all of a sudden, I'm like going, what the hell is the moon doing out? And why is it green of all things as I'm flying like this and out of the, the peripheral vision? And all of a sudden the reel goes, brake right, brake right. And as I immediately brake right, I take a look, it's another F-14, and the green light was his position light on his right wing. So what that dude had done, and he was from VF1, what he had done is he had gone up through, took his timing above and let down. And thank God he was a little left correcting right, and I was a little right correcting to the left side, driving up to the glide slope, and he had started down on it. And then, in retrospect, relative motion the way it was, we're all kind of constant speed. It wouldn't have been a big impact, but it certainly got our attention. And now, here we are as a tube ship. Who's it? Which one's going to land? The LSO's like, okay, which one of you two am I taking? I think that was actually the call. And I said, okay, I'll go around, and I peel off to the right, and he ends up landing, and then we come around and trap. And that was just one of those things, the old adage, the boat is going to try to kill you. That was kind of the gospel guys would tell you when flying around the ship. They're going to try to kill you, right? So always be, head on a swivel, be very careful what you do, and know where you're at all times. And that was just one of those things you go, you got to be kidding me. They would try to do that. And, as it was, no harm, no foul. And he came aboard, and of course the debrief was pretty interesting, as you can imagine, with the LSO, what the hell happened and all that other stuff. But anyway, so that was one of those things you go, yeah, I don't want to do that again. But
it's something not as like to phrase as simple as landing, and that is obviously an understatement when it comes to landing on the boat, right? But that's an admin piece. It's not going to do an ACM where you got planes turning and tumbling in the sky. Putting your pants on to go to work, that's what you're essentially doing there, and how quickly it can go sideways. And obviously, throughout your aviation career, and we hear like the takeoff and landing phase, that's usually where things go sideways. And if you're going to land on a moving runway, that's a whole nother aspect.
Yeah, and you get it's all what you're accustomed to, and daytime, there was no greater sport than landing aboard the boat. Because what they would do is, instead of this extended Marshall pattern and one at a time for some sort of ILS, you would circle overhead the boat if it's VMC, right? And you'd have the tankers way up above if you needed gas or whatever, but then everybody's just stacked up. And the fighters were always we had F-14s and A-6s. We never had any Hornets on the Ranger. So the fighters were at the lowest altitude, whether it's 3,000 or 2,000 feet, I can't remember. But, you usually got a two-ship. Your sister squadron's got the two-ship, and they're in the circle. And so the whole thing was to be the first guys aboard. You wanted to beat your sister squadron to the break, to the overhead, and because that's what you want to do, right? Be the best. And so you get these guys, and then what you would also do prior to takeoff is you'd look at the launch pattern for the next cycle. So you knew how many planes, and you would do a count. You would call it hawking the deck and watch what was going on to set yourself up to be in the overhead just as they're wrapping up everything. And so you're the first ones down. So the big trick was, how do you get in front of your opponents across the circle doing this orbit, right? The VF1 if you're in VF2. So one of the things I used to do was, when I was the lead, I'd start inching back the throttle. right? And so whether you're start at 270 or 250, I get back to like 230. And now these guys end up behind you just because they don't see it soon enough. And now they're behind. So they're not going to cut across the circle in front of you because that would be dangerous. They're kind of stuck where they are. So, and then the other thing, Rain, what you would do is as you got more comfortable, there was an old adage, if your airspeed was greater than your altitude in the overhead, that's what you're looking for, right? Because the LSOs are out there, and man, if you could even be in a little afterburner at the time, that's even better. So if you could come down, I think, I probably would see 450, maybe 500 knots if I felt really good on that day. But you couldn't bleed the airspeed off if you flew parallel up the starboard side of the ship, and then did the overhead brake. You needed some turn to bleed energy. So what you would do is you'd come across the ass end, the stern of the ship, at your speed, but you'd start to pull right there. And then you could bleed off from 500 knots down to your approach speed to drop your gear flaps and all that other stuff and still be able to make the trap. But God forbid you screwed it up, right, and couldn't bleed the energy off, and you end up boltering, and which means missing the wires or get a wave off because you're not even in there. Now you've just caused a whole bunch of problems because the ship's got to wait again for you, and the whole time Naval Aviation is trying to limit the time the ship's in the wind because they're vulnerable. Submarines, all that, you become a kind of it's not static, but a known speed and direction. And you don't want to have that for a long period of time. But when it works, it's fabulous. But when it doesn't work, it's always kind of some hell to pay down in the ready room or whatever. But
hearing the guys talk about the LSO aspect of it,
yes,
it is a science from hitting the perch point, the timing, depending on the sea state, what the ship's doing, watching. That's why I am impressed by it. And I know once you do it a million times as an LSO, stand on the back and you can see the slight pitch changes or maybe the exhaust cans or black smoke, whatever it might be. You got a pretty good feeling of when this guy rolls out on final, like if it's going to work or not, probably right away versus that's such a nuanced, that's precision that goes into that science. But if you pork it away, obviously the other things you mentioned, I don't know if it that F-35 a couple of years ago, I think that one might have been porked away. Maybe there was some flight control issues, but
I'm not
trying to put off launch really fast.
Back then, like I said, there wasn't any digital flight controls, and it wasn't as easy as it was now. Now to the point of in the newer airplanes, they have this thing called Magic Carpet, so they have designed software within the airplanes, and I never had a chance to fly it. It's my understanding. You have digital auto throttles with digital, fuel control systems. Everything's, perfect. And you take the stick. Let's say you're a little low. You pull the stick back to get the ball centered, and then you go to neutral. It takes all that into account, adds the power that needs, adds different flight control inputs to keep your same angle of attack. And to the point now where I believe you don't even go to the boat in the training command in T-45. So you may want to check this before you put it out on video, but
it's now etched in stone. This is the fact. So
okay, well, good. I might as well go out and say this is what it should be. But I know that you may not go to the boat until you go to your first squadron, be it F-35s or Hornets, in the case of being a naval fighter aviation. So so the other job that I had too is being an LSO and sitting on the platform. And one of the things that's a little different, I don't know if anybody's talked about this before, but when the sea state gets to be such that it overpowers the gyros on that lens, right? The lens, Fresnel lens, is gyro stabilized in a normal. A huge carrier is not going to pitch that much, but there are some sea states that are pretty aggressive and it will start pitching. They'll have to replace that with a thing called Mobius, which basically is an LSO-controlled glide slope indication on this instrument. So green datum lines that look exactly the same to the pilot out there, but then in the middle, the ball will go up and down given the input of what the LSO is doing on the platform. So, and it was kind of a cool setup. The post stuck into the deck of the carrier, and there was a handle on it in which a couple buttons you could give a wave off light. I don't know if you've seen LSOs, they're holding something over their head. I think I sent you a picture you can put in. On that, there's a button on the top that can be used for a little power. It's called a cut light. It can be used for request a little power without having to say anything. A little lights come on. I think they were green above the thing. Or the wave off light, which was the big trigger finger, and then the ball goes away and red lights flash, and then the pilot is commanded to do a go around without having to say it. So anyway, that same thing got put in a handle, and it was on this vertical, I guess, assembly that it was on a slider, and you could feel where they put a notch in it. And if that thing was in the notch, the ball behind you was showing on glide slope. So you never had to look over your shoulder. You knew that if it's in the notch and he's on glide slope and you want to show him on path, you put it in the notch. The guy on the approach is going a little high. You would pull it out of the notch, start lifting it up a little bit, and the ball would show him high. And then, of course, you should see a correction, and you would lead him down to show him an on-glide path as he approached it. So the back of the ship could be doing this, but as long as you had a horizon line, and after a while, you know what 3.5 degrees looks like. One thing about naval aviation, we had a 3.5 degree glide slope, which effectively was 3 degrees because the boat's moving 25 knots away from the airplane, right? Just the way the dynamics work out. So anyway, you would do that, and we practiced it on good days, and then on bad days too. You'd bring it out and have to do it. And there was a whole art form with it. You know, you'd watch the guy. He's got the ramp cleared. Then you start showing him a little high because that kind of gets him down. He'll start to make a correction to come down into the wires. And so, but that's the way heavy sea states were handled. You know, trying to get birds aboard the boat. And there's some great YouTube videos out there of just some unbelievable stuff that's gone on. And I fortunately never had to deal with that, that bad of a weather in that regard. But anyway.
Yet again, why I'm glad I went the Air Force route. Anytime I hear those stories, I'm like, that just sounds absolutely terrible. But it's amazing that guys and gals can navigate through that process, which not easy.